And now, we can do it without knowing Greek and Latin. Now, obviously, it's much better to know Greek and Latin. It's much richer. But we have wonderful translations, English translations today. And they did back then, too, but not to the extent that we do today. And so that makes it even easier for us to go back to these sources that these rich veins, I think, need to be tapped into. After all, why are they classics? They're classics because, we call them classics because they have survived a very rigorous process that I call literary natural selection. And I'm not using that term frivolously, I really mean it, because how did these things survive? Well, because for centuries before print, many people decided that these things are so valuable that we're going to devote years of our lives, our whole lives, to copying them laboriously by hand. And these were societies that were centuries removed from Greece and Rome, and yet they felt that these classics are so valuable that we're going to devote our lives to copying them. That's why they've survived, and that's why we tend to look at Greece and Rome and see only the excellence. There was a lot of trash, they produced a lot of trash just like we did. It's just they didn't survive because a monk wasn't going to spend his entire life copying trash, right? So that's what I mean by literary natural selection. These things, and I don't mean to go overboard on that, but not 100% of these things are great, but a lot of them are, and that's why they survived. And so we should take that to heart, I think, and rather than simply dismiss them because they're old, we should look at them and say, what do they have to teach us today? Obviously, these were texts that were universal in application. That's why they survived for so many centuries. They were rich and deep. So what is it that they can teach us today? And I think they can teach us quite a bit today. I could give many examples, but let me give you just one example. Shortly after 9/11, I reread Sallust, his Catiline's War. And I was really struck as though almost as though this book had been taken from the headlines of the day. Let me give you just a short version of this. Catiline was a corrupt aristocrat who decided he was going to overthrow the Roman Republic, and he had many conspirators, co-conspirators, and he left the city of Rome to raise an army. Meanwhile, he left conspirators behind, and they were what we today would call terrorists. They had plans to set fire to the city, which was a wooden city. That's terrorism, really, is the basis form in those days. To murder senators almost randomly, just to create chaos. That was their goal. So this would allow Catiline to return with his army and take over the city. So Cicero, who was the consul, the executive at that time, discovers this plot, and they capture some of the co-conspirators. And so there's a big debate in the Senate. What do we do with these guys that we captured? They've basically confessed to being terrorists, and plus there are more of them out there. We don't know how many. Does this sound familiar? I mean, I'm reading this right after 9/11. So what do we do with these guys? Well, they have a big debate in the Senate about it. On the one hand, we have Cato the Younger, who argues for security, the security argument. And then we have, this is very ironic, but we have Julius Caesar, ironic in view of his later actions, but he's arguing for law and liberty, right? And what do we do with these guys? There's no Guantanamo we can put them in. The idea of permanent prisons is a very modern idea because it's very expensive. They didn't have permanent prisons. They had a few makeshift jails to keep people until you actually did the punishment, which was usually physical. So what do we do with these guys? Well, Cato gives this very eloquent, impassioned speech for security. He says, look, we don't know how many fellow conspirators there are out there. We can't afford to go through due process of law with these fellows. We just can't afford that. If we keep them in some makeshift jail, their buddies will come and break them out, and then we'll be in real trouble. So that's a spokesman for security. Now Caesar comes along, and he's the spokesman for liberty and law, and he says, now wait a minute. He says, I don't like these terrorists any more than you do. I think they're horrible. I'd just assume they'd be killed. But there is law. They are Roman citizens. They do deserve a trial. And furthermore, you know, Caesar, always being the pragmatist, gives a practical argument as well, which is that after this crisis has passed and the danger has subsided, people will blame you if you violate the law. Does that sound familiar? And so we have this wonderful debate, and it's not one-sided. I mean, Sallust is very fair and even-handed in presenting this debate between security on the one hand and law and liberty on the other hand. This seemed to me stripped from the headlines of the day because every republic has that conflict between security and liberty and law. And how do you reconcile those two things? There's no easy answer. And yet this text that was written over 2,000 years ago deals with this very same issue. And so I think, you know, things like that are worth studying, I think, not only for the president, but for all of us as we struggle as citizens with these questions. And it really shows why the classics are the classics, because they deal with universal themes, universal subjects, and they do so in a very deep, rich way, not in a simplistic fashion. And so I think, to conclude, I think the lesson for President Obama and for the rest of us is that maybe it's time now, after all these centuries, maybe it's time to return to the fountain of Western civilization where the founders filled their own buckets. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 5 minutes before our scheduled break, so if you would like to come up and ask questions of any of the panelists, please feel free. I would ask you, though, please to come up to one of the standing microphones.
Gentlemen, we want to thank you for enjoying this. I got a question I want to ask you. When the three departments of our government conflicted, and put a little question to you. Back in 1830, we had some problems in the Cherokee Indians, and it's in the news today and tomorrow. They're having a convention back there in that section, northern Georgia, southern Tennessee. And the homesteaders and, of course, our immigrants and our relatives came, and we want to push them out of it. And yes, the President said we'll push them out of there, and Congress said we'll push them out of there. And the Indians took it to the Supreme Court, 1832. And the Supreme Court supported the Indians. But a president didn't carry it out. His name was Andrew Jackson. What would you fellows have done if you were in Congress as senators or congressmen at that time? How would you handle it?
I would have done exactly what you wanted me to do.
Take a break. Take a break.
Well, and, you know, obviously you're referring to the separation of powers and this conflict between the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court. The idea that the Supreme Court has the final word was a very controversial proposal. When the Supreme Court claimed in Marbury versus Madison that it had the power of judicial review, many people didn't agree with that. And that's why the court used it only twice before the Civil War. The other case was Dred Scott, which was a disaster, because many people didn't believe they had that power, and obviously Jackson was one.